The subcommittee's first hearing of the new year is called to order. To mark this occasion, I can think of no more fitting subject for us to focus on than Turkey. As we watch the turmoil in Syria and the displacement of millions of civilians, no one needs a reminder about the vital place Turkey holds on the world stage. Any lasting solution in that part of the world must involve Turkey. However, our hope is that Turkey is not only stable and peaceful, but also democratic and secular as well, with a strong and independent civil society and a government that upholds fundamental freedom. Things are changing in Turkey, and today we ask, are those changes for the better or for the worse? President Erdogan and his party, the AKP, after well over a decade in power, failed to secure a majority of seats in the parliament during the elections last June. The pro-Kurdish HDP attracted a cross-section of secular Turks and Kurdish voters and entered parliament as the fourth major political party. Yet, following that election, no party was able to build a coalition and form a government. So in November, a second round of voting took place, and the AKP regained its majority. Unfortunately, that may reflect the AKP's appeal to the Turkish nationalists over renewed fighting. And I say it's unfortunate if this is the reason why they're still in power, is because there's been renewed fighting and the Turkey may be becoming more polarized rather than being elected because we've done a more harmonious job. We'll be asking our witnesses to comment on that. During today's hearing, I hope to discuss how these elections and the shifting domestic political environment within Turkey will play out over this coming year. What about reports of a crackdown on independent journalism and journalists? How will the latest PKK Turkish fighting affect events in Syria? And how will it affect the people who live in Turkey? As I stated during this subcommittee's previous hearing on Turkey, our discussions and our comments and even our criticisms of the Turkish government are predicated on a deep respect for the Turkish people and a deep respect for the Turkish nation and the role that it has played over the last century. That said, sometimes friends, and that is what the United States and Turkey are, we are friends, but friends need to speak plainly to one another about problems and about challenges that they both face. There is a reason for concern that President Erdogan's continuing effort to empower his office by passing a new constitution and creating a powerful Turkish-style presidential system is harmful to Turkish democracy. Some of his policies at home and abroad raise alarm bells, and there should be people paying attention to disturbing reports of what appears to be abuses of power. The natural ebb and flow of democracy in Turkey is being impacted by Erdogan's extension of his already historically long term at the center of power in his country. Recent actions against the Kurds appear to indicate a violent strategy based on military action. That's not the way that we're going to build a more peaceful region, is it? Or perhaps that's not the way you bring peace to your country, is basing your, basing the common good and basically the tranquility of your country on military action and fear. So today we are interested in talking to our witnesses, seeing what they have to say about these, as I say, trends of concern about Turkey. And with that, I would turn to my ranking member, see if he has an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for organizing today's subcommittee's hearing on the political trends in Turkey, who is one of our most important allies in an increasingly complicated region. And I am especially grateful for the opportunity to look at the domestic situation which drives Turkey's foreign policy. While President Erdogan enjoys strong support, the Kurdish nationalist-rooted HDP was successful in achieving a voice in parliament. That's a good thing. That's democracy. Much to the concern of the international observers, however, we have been informed that the Kurdish message has been suppressed by the ruling party. And as someone who represents the minority voice in government, here, the minority party, also as an African American, where we feel voices are not heard, I am deeply concerned with how Turkey will find a peaceful political resolution to the Kurdish question. I always equate what's going on someplace else with what we did and what happens in the United States of America. And I think one of the keys in the 60s with the issues of African Americans, for example, and the genius of Dr. King working with the government was there was a peaceful resolution to the questions of African Americans that we're still dealing with. Clearly, one cannot completely separate domestic Turkish issues from international concerns. For example, Turkey has been doing a commendable job in housing over 2.5 million Syrian refugees. Turkey is taking in those families fleeing Assad's bombs and ISIS repression, while other countries, including the United States, are reluctant to do so. In this effort, Turkey is carrying the world's burden in the face of evil and addressing a grave humanitarian crisis. And while Germany and the EU seek a more cooperative relationship with Turkey, today's congressional hearing is an important examination of the nature of our relationship with Turkey. During Vice President Biden's recent trip to Turkey, he rightly stressed the importance of a values-based approach to our cooperation with Turkey, both bilaterally and within NATO. We in the United States Congress are concerned with the democratic progress in Turkey. Tolerance in the face of domestic criticism is difficult, and regional events further complicate the situation. Believe me, I know. But nevertheless, we fully defend the fight for academic freedom, for freedom of the press, and for the right of individuals to criticize their governments, as well as as hard and as difficult as it may be to hear. People should have the right to voice those concerns. As we all know too well, in America, suppressing these voices only leads to an erosion of democracy and then eventually to violence. And as violence spreads across southeastern Turkey, we are reminded of the delicacy of the balance between security and liberty. Tragically, they are not isolated incidents. They serve to highlight the need of a path to peace between the government and the Kurdish forces. What could that path look like? Should and will the Constitution be changed to accommodate such a process? Turkey's democratic progress in the region is essential for our shared ideas. And today's conversation about the domestic situation in Turkey may be difficult, but it is essential for our understanding. We need to, I think, as members of Congress, to try to really understand what is taking place on a domestic basis on the ground in Turkey, just as I'm sure that some need to understand on a domestic basis what is taking place here in the United States as we are getting involved in our political system and our presidential election. So I thank the chairman for this hearing because we want to learn and understand so that we can make sure that we're working collectively for democracy and working collectively to stomp out those who are threats to us all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yeah, we appreciate your very substantive remarks that you said us inaugurated this hearing with. Mr. Cicilline, I understand, has a short opening statement as well.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher and Ranking Member Meeks, for calling this important and timely hearing. The issue of Turkey, its political atmosphere, and its role in the region is critically important. A key ally in the fight against ISIS in Syria, Turkey has its own internal political dynamics that are driving its overall military policy. A key factor in this is Prime Minister Erdogan and the AKP's relationship with the Kurds and other minorities. Erdogan's decision to abandon the peace process with the PKK and undertake a harsh crackdown against Kurds, including civilians, is extremely disturbing. Since July, approximately 230 civilians have been killed during the campaign by the Turkish government. Tens of thousands of people have been forced from their homes, and the Turkish military has essentially created a war zone within the Kurdish part of southeast Turkey. Kurdish political leaders have been rounded up and imprisoned without due process, and there's been a widespread crackdown on media and civil society. In line with its targeting of religious and ethnic minorities, Turkey has also continued its policies of antagonizing Armenia by supporting Azerbaijan in the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. Sadly, the Turkish government continues to deny the very well-established history of genocide against the Armenian people. Turkey certainly has a right to protect itself from terrorism, but we should all be alarmed by the anti-democratic tactics that Turkey has been using against the Kurds, other minorities, and more widely against Prime Minister Erdogan's perceived critics. Turkey was once solidly on the path to democratization, and I fear that it has strayed so far that it may not be able to recover. And while the United States must continue to support Turkey in the fight against ISIS and its absorption of refugees, we do it at our own peril if we let the issues of democracy and human rights fall by the wayside. So I look forward to working with my colleagues on these issues and hearing the testimony of our witnesses today. And thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for the courtesy. And I yield back.
And we appreciate your presence with us today. The witnesses will proceed, and following my introduction, and I would just request that if you could, again, have your actual written testimony presented, but keeping your remarks down to about 5 minutes. First, we have with us, and I will introduce all of the witnesses. Nate, and please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Schenken? Schenken, okay, got it. Nate Schenken is the Freedom House Project Director for their annual Nations in Transit report. He previously served as Senior Program Officer for Freedom House's Eurasia program, which covers Turkey and Central Asia. Ali Sinar is Executive Vice President of the Turkish Heritage Organization, a nonprofit group established to promote dialogue around Turkey's role in the world and the U.S.-Turkey relationships. And finally, Dr. Gönül Toll, got it, okay, is the founding director of the Middle East Institute Center for Turkey Studies and an adjacent professor at George Washington University. She has written about Turkey extensively and frequently appears in the media. She has earned her PhD from Florida International University. And Nate, you may proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Meeks, and members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to testify before you. I ask that my full written testimony be entered into the record.
Without objection.
I last appeared before this subcommittee in July 2014 to speak then about the future of Turkish democracy. I described how the government, led by then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan, pursued an aggressive, society-wide crackdown on dissent in response to the Gezi Park protests of June 2013 and the corruption cases against the government in December 2013. Since that time, the situation for democracy and freedom of expression in Turkey has significantly worsened, and most significantly, the government has returned to open conflict with the PKK in July 2015, which has resulted in the deaths of at least 230 civilians inside Turkey and 230 Turkish security forces, while the president says that the state has killed 3,000 PKK militants. The Islamic State suicide bombers during this time have killed another 135 Turkish citizens and 11 foreign visitors to Istanbul. The return to conflict is in significant part the result of leaving the war in Syria to fester. This has emboldened radical parts of the Kurdish movement in Turkey by showing that violence can achieve autonomy, and it has strengthened the position of Turkish nationalists in Turkey. Turkish members of the Islamic State who have traveled frequently to Syria have entered the fray and are trying to widen this cleavage. In this context, President Erdogan and the AKP took what I believe is a cynical decision in July to return to war with the PKK to strengthen their position in the November 1st repeat parliamentary elections. This decision has played into the hands of hardliners within the PKK that are threatened by the success of the HDP, the Kurdish Movement Party, which promotes nonviolent integration into the Turkish state in order to realize Kurdish rights. The conflict is having terrible consequences. There is the horrific civilian death toll that I mentioned. There have been at least 62 day and night curfews for military operations since July, including some lasting up to 2 weeks and some that are going on now. Tens of thousands of people have been forced from their homes, and the military is using tanks and heavy weaponry inside of Turkish cities. At least 22 HDP members of parliament are under criminal investigation, as is the HDP mayor of Diyarbakir. Dozens of local officials from the HDP and other Kurdish parties have been arrested, including 18 co-mayors. Last week, prosecutors requested at least 7 years imprisonment for the mayor of Mardin, Ahmet Turk, who's one of the elder statesmen of the Kurdish movement in Turkey. These are the people on whom the peace process relied, and without them, it will be impossible to end the cycle of conflict. This crackdown comes on top of one that was already taking place on media and civil society. The government has branded the Gulen movement officially a terrorist organization and is persecuting it relentlessly after the movement helped launch the December 2013 corruption investigations. The newspaper Bugün and the TV stations Bugün and Kanal Turk were seized immediately previous to the November 1st parliamentary election. There are over 108,000 websites blocked in Turkey. Many of these now, increasingly, are Kurdish websites or websites linked to the Gulen movement, like the magazine Nokta. In the last quarter of 2015 alone, there were 93 cases for insult and violation of personal rights of President Erdogan, including against 42 journalists. That's practically one per day. In 2015, 19 journalists and 2 cartoonists received prison sentences for insulting President Erdogan or other high officials. The editor-in-chief and the Ankara bureau chief of the country's oldest newspaper, Cumhuriyet, are facing possible life sentences for reporting on the National Intelligence Agency's use of humanitarian convoys to smuggle weapons into Syria. I have 2 recommendations. The Turkish government's attempt to destroy the Kurdish movement inside Turkey, which is, I believe, what is happening, is counterproductive, not only to peace in Turkey, but to the efforts of the United States to bring an end to the crises in Syria and Iraq. The conflict in Turkey is contributing to deepening radicalization of Kurds in Turkey and in Syria, and foreclosing a possibility that Turkey will be able to coexist with a stronger Kurdish presence in northern Syria, which is an inevitable outcome of any end to this crisis. The U.S. should call on its political capital, both with the government of Turkey and with the Kurdish movement in Syria, to bring about a ceasefire in Turkey and a return to the peace process. Second, when I testified in 2014, I advocated a strong U.S. emphasis on EU membership for Turkey in order to encourage progress on human rights. I must admit such a policy now seems untenable. Despite a superficial commitment to EU accession, the current government has repeatedly and directly rejected the requirements of EU membership in the areas of human rights and rule of law. The EU's decision this fall to trade Turkish cooperation on stopping refugee flows in exchange for a supposedly reinvigorated accession process has discredited membership by making it a matter of quid pro quo instead of a matter of political and economic convergence. Advancing Turkish accession to the EU at the expense of the EU's human rights principles has exposed the EU as cynical and short-sighted and has undermined its greatest strength as a rules-based, values-driven institution. Thank you.
Mr. Sinar?
Dear Mr. Chairman and subcommittee members, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today. As an American with a Turkish descent, a longtime community leader, I'm honored to be one of the witnesses of Turkey political trends in 2016. Mr. Chairman, I would like to summarize my written statement. I believe 2015 was an extraordinary year in US and Turkish relations. Whether it was in foreign or domestic policy, economy, or military, there was no shortage of critical developments and cooperation between 2 nations. Just to give you an example, over the past 12 months, the US and Turkey have continued to work together to fight ISIS, provide assistance to 2.2 million Syrian refugees living in Turkey, and strengthen economic cooperation during G20 summit. Most recently, the US, along with other NATO ally countries, stood behind Turkey in downing of Russian fighter jet that violated Turkish airspace in November 2015. I believe it's important to emphasize that most of these critical developments took place at a time when Turks were experiencing critical domestic challenges. Results of free, fair, and peaceful second election showcased the strength of the democratic process in Turkey. Despite their differences on various issues, the US was indeed of a strong and secure Turkish government that was first and foremost ready to cooperate in the campaign against ISIS and play a critical role in Syria. Having put all these developments behind it, I would like to briefly highlight the Turkey's priorities in 2016. National security. For over 30 years, Turkey has confronted violence by a militant terrorist group known as Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK. During this time, more than 40,000 lives have been lost in Turkey. PKK attacks have once again flared up in Turkey since July 11, 2015, when the PKK announced the end of the ceasefire that had existed for 2.5 years. Some are attempting to mischaracterize recent events as Turkish hostility towards all Kurds. However, the reality is far different. Ethnic Kurdish citizens of Turkey are an integral part of the nation. Turkey established strong relations with the Kurdish regional government in the region, which are not limited to military support and financial aid. Honorable committee members and Mr. Chairman, I would like to draw your attention to PKK's recent terrorist attacks. PKK and the Kurdish citizens in Turkey are totally different. 221 Turkish security personnel and 89 civilians have been killed by PKK. 1,011 security personnel and 477 civilians have been wounded by PKK. 14 security personnel and 110 civilians have been kidnapped by PKK. In recent years, several Kurdish language television and radio stations have been established in Turkey. Courses teaching Kurdish language and dialects have been created, and the Turkish Kurds have significant representation in the Turkish parliament and elsewhere in the government. Presently, there are more than 120 parliamentarians out of 550 of Kurdish origin in Turkish parliament from various political parties. Most Turkish Kurds don't support PKK, which ended ceasefire on July 2015. In addition to PKK, Turkey is threatened by ISIL, terrorist acts such as those in Suruç, Ankara, and Istanbul. Border security and control measures along the 511 border have improved significantly. It's my understanding that strengthening of its border security has already made important contributions. Humanitarian aid, according to the United Nations, Turkey shelters the largest number of refugees in the world. Total expenditures for Syrians is $7.6 billion and rapidly aging toward $8 billion US. Turkey has announced it will offer Syrian refugees work permits in order to encourage fewer of them to migrate. Freedom of expression and media constitutes an important pillar of human rights priorities for Turkey. It's a fundamental freedom guaranteed under the Constitution and relevant legislation. Turkey is planning a series of comprehensive judicial reforms in line with both our international and European Union standards and principles for the protection and promotion of freedom, expression, and media. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman and subcommittee members, I'm optimistic about Turkey's future and US-Turkish relations. I believe, starting this year, Turkey will begin to effectively address its domestic and foreign policy challenges, strengthen its global position. I believe that strong partnership and friendship, rooted in common values and strategic interests, reinforced by the enduring links between the people of both countries, will continue to get stronger this year. I would like to thank you again, Mr. Chairman and committee members, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, and Dr. Toll.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, it's an honor to be invited to speak with you today.
You need to move a little closer, please. And if it's on,
It's on.
Can you move it a little closer to you, please? There you go. Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, I will summarize my statement now and submit the full text for the record. 2015 was a difficult year for Turkey. The Islamic State launched 3 attacks inside Turkey, killing more than 140 people and wounding hundreds. Journalists have been fired, detained, prosecuted, and physically attacked. Economic growth has slowed sharply, and several factors have left Ankara more isolated in its neighborhood. The ongoing chaos in Syria, Turkey's downing of a Russian jet, Ankara's deployment of troops in Iraq without the approval of Baghdad, joining a Sunni alliance with the Saudis to counterbalance Iran. But most concerning of all, however, is the ongoing conflict between the Turkish state and the PKK. A string of clashes in the mainly Kurdish region between the PKK and Turkish security forces has left hundreds, including women and children, dead since the 2-year-old ceasefire broke down in July. And areas of the Kurdish region have been subject to round-the-clock curfews since then. During state-imposed curfews, the wounded have been denied access to medical treatment, neighborhoods have had their water and electricity cut, and have been left without access to food. For decades, Turkey's conflict with the Kurds has hindered Turkey's democratization. Neither Turkey's democratization nor the Kurdish quest for political rights have occupied an important place in US policy towards Ankara and the Kurds. Turkey's democratic shortcomings have been ignored by US administrations for the sake of greater geostrategic interests. In a similar fashion, Kurdish rights have been overlooked in the game of power politics. But as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, today's regional context ties Turkish democracy and the peaceful resolution of the Kurdish conflict to US's security interests in the region. Turkey still considers the PKK and the PKK-linked PYD in Syria a bigger threat than the Islamic State. Therefore, Ankara has not played the effective role the United States has been seeking from its NATO ally in the fight against ISIS. Although Turkey has recently stepped up its efforts to counter ISIS, at times Ankara worked at direct odds with the US anti-ISIS strategy by targeting Washington's most effective partner on the ground, the PYD. Turkey's refusal to engage with the PYD also complicates the UN talks on ending the Syrian civil war. Recently, Turkey has warned the United Nations and the United States that it will walk out of the political process if the PYD is included among the opposition to the Assad regime. And the UN envoy decided not to invite the PYD to the meetings in Geneva. The exclusion of the PYD from future meetings is likely to complicate efforts to find a political solution, as they are the most powerful Kurdish faction controlling around 10% in Syria. If Turkey fails to find a peaceful resolution to its Kurdish question, Ankara will keep attacking the Kurds, rendering US strategy against ISIS less effective and derailing the political process. The prospects for both the government and the Kurds to de-escalate the conflict, however, remain slim in 2016. Therefore, it is necessary for the United States to use its leverage over both parties to push for a ceasefire and a return to the negotiating table. The fighting is likely to intensify in the spring when more PKK militants return to Turkey from their winter bases in the mountains. Escalation of the conflict will deal a further blow to Turkey's democracy and harden ethnic identities on both sides, making it even more difficult to resume negotiations. It will also undercut US efforts to counter ISIS, pursue a political solution to the conflict in Syria, and promote an inclusive government in Iraq. Without a rapid political solution to the Kurdish problem, Turkey will remain an ineffective partner in the fight against ISIS, derail future efforts to find a political solution to the Syrian conflict, and fail to play a constructive role in Iraq and the region. To secure Turkey's full cooperation in Syria, Iraq, and the fight against ISIS, the United States must use its leverage. Washington has leverage over the PYD and the PKK. US cooperation with the PYD has been crucial for the group as it boosted the PYD diplomatically and militarily. Washington has influence over Ankara as well. After the crisis with Russia and the ongoing chaos on its doorstep, Turkey has rediscovered its Western allies. Turkey feels threatened by Putin's actions and values its NATO membership more than ever, which gives the United States more leverage over Ankara than it had a few months ago. The United States could use both Ankara's current vulnerability and isolation in its immediate neighborhood and several trust-building measures to secure Ankara's cooperation. As a trust-building measure, the US could redeploy Patriot missiles in Turkey. That would ease some of Ankara's security concerns stemming from Syria and show Ankara that the United States is committed to Turkey's security. Washington could also eliminate another sticking point in Turkey-US relations. Turkey has long opposed engaging the PYD, arguing that it is linked to the outlawed PKK and that the PYD fights alongside the Assad regime. If Washington can convince the PYD to take a clearer stance against the Assad regime, it might be relatively easier for Ankara to drop its opposition to the PYD's involvement in the political process. The PKK sees the conflict in Turkey through the lens of the developments in Syria. The US PYD cooperation in Syria, therefore, is crucial for the PKK's strategic calculations. The United States could use that leverage to pressure the PKK to de-escalate the conflict. And that, in turn, could give Ankara a face-saving way to de-escalate its heavy-handed military operations. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your testimony today. And so let me just ask the basic question of each of you. Is the situation in Turkey of greater concern today than it was a year ago?
Yes, absolutely.
Sir?
It's improving, Mr. Chairman.
It's improving, okay.
Yes.
So we got one sort of not improving, one improving, and Dr. Toll? I gotta push that button, we can't hear you otherwise.
It's certainly worse than it was a year ago.
Okay, so you got 2 votes for worse and 1 vote for better. Oh, improving. Well, better is improving, isn't it? That's all right. Dr. Toll, your suggestion that we have influence over the Kurdish population in Turkey and their conflict with their own government, could you expand upon that a little bit? Because it seems that your suggestions were predicated on the fact that we have that type of influence.
I believe, Mr. Chairman, Washington has leverage not over the Kurdish population, but over the PKK and the PYD in Syria. Because after the US airdropped weapons to the PYD in 2014, the PYD's international image has changed, has been transformed. And the PYD today is working very closely with the United States in Syria. The PYD has become almost the ground troops for the anti-ISIS coalition.
What would you have us do, and what kind of pressure would you have us put on them?
I think on the PYD, the US government could certainly pressure the PYD to take a clearer stance against the Assad regime. That's been one of the concerns of Ankara. Recently,
Excuse me, so could you repeat that? A clearer stand against?
Against the Assad regime. Because recently Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu said that one of the reasons why Turkey is opposed to any role for the PYD in the Syrian opposition is that the PYD has close links with the Assad regime and they're fighting alongside the Assad regime. So I believe if the PYD takes a clearer stance, then Ankara will have a face-saving way of changing its stance vis-a-vis the PYD.
Okay. And is it the United States' interest that the Assad regime then ceases to exist? Is that what you're saying?
Excuse me, could you repeat the question?
So you're predicating that on a belief that the Assad regime would be better for the United States if the Assad regime would collapse and go away? In
my personal opinion, I think in the US's interest and Turkey's interest to see the Assad regime toppled. But I think the Obama administration, its first priority is confronting the Islamic State, not toppling the Assad regime.
Okay,
And
well, that's what I was trying to get at. It seems to me that the Assad regime, whatever happens there, it's just like what happened with, too bad our Bush presidents didn't understand that what Saddam Hussein did within his own country wasn't worth American intervention. And Assad may be killing people who want to kill us. And that may be a good thing. So what is your assessment of that, Mr. Sinar?
I mean, for Turkey, ISIS, PKK, and PYD are the same. Thousands of PKK militants are fighting on the front lines of PYD. The chain of the command for both terror organizations and their leaders are related to Mount Kandil. Both adopt Abdullah Öcalan, which is the founder PKK terrorist organization leader. And I would like to highlight that PYD declaration of 2013 stating, the PYD is undertaking a revolution to build a democratic society in West Kurdistan. Later on, time will come for North Kurdistan, which is in Turkey. So Turkey is against the PYD because they are right now encouraging some Kurdish citizens to declare autonomous, which 4 cities right now is in trouble right now, and start to target to the Turkish security personnel. So Turkey is respect to the Kurdish citizens, but PYD has a different objective, showing that they are fighting with ISIS, but at the same time they are collaborating right now PKK, which is a big threat to Turkey. And as I said on my statement, Turkey is also helping the other Kurdish groups, including militarily and also financial aid to the Kurdish groups that are also fighting with against ISIS.
I think you made your case very well that Erdogan's government, they knew the government of Turkey is had some major steps aimed at trying to either have reconciliation or reach out to the Kurds. I'd like to get Mr. Schenken's reaction to that.
Specifically on the question of outreach to the Kurds?
Yeah, the gentleman is suggesting, your suggestion is that there's more repression.
Correct.
And journalists are being thrown in jail, opposition parties are being charged with criminal offenses, corruption, et cetera, which I don't think that ever happens here, but it's happening there. And that this gentleman, on the other hand, thinks that the government's reached out to the Kurds, and there's no excuse for opposition to become violent opposition.
If I may, the sequence of events I think is very important, and I wrote about it in my written testimony, which is that there was a ceasefire with the PKK, and so if we looked back directly a year ago, we would be looking at a period of time when the ceasefire was still in effect and when there were negotiations ongoing between the Turkish government, this government, and the PKK. There were delegations going to visit Abdullah Öcalan in prison in order to have his voice be heard in those negotiations. And at the end of February, there was a joint announcement by the Turkish government and the leaders of the Kurdish movement, members of the HDP, of a roadmap for how to get to peace. And we could talk perhaps about whether that roadmap was implementable, but it was a roadmap and it was a joint announcement. 3 weeks after that, 3 weeks later in March, President Erdogan rejected that roadmap, said that he had never been informed about these negotiations, which was never plausible. And even this weekend, his deputy prime minister, Bülent Arınç, another of the co-founders of the AKP, said explicitly he knew about the negotiations, he knew exactly what their contents were. Why did Erdogan denounce this agreement? I think that's a very, very key question. What happened in March 2015? I believe that what happened is that Erdogan recognized he would not get his constitutional reform, he would not get his presidential system through a negotiation with the Kurdish parties. And if he couldn't get it through the Kurdish parties, the only other source he could get it from would be the nationalist parties in Turkey. And therefore, a nationalist policy is what he had to pursue, and that's what he did pursue. From March through June 7th, in the first elections, where he did not succeed in getting a parliamentary majority, and then again in the new elections.
So it's your position that his turnaround on that, what you consider to be a very pivotal negotiation, has actually spurred violence
Absolutely.
in the country, and thus created a cycle where you have violence, repression, et cetera.
Absolutely.
All right. Now, Mr. Meeks, would you like to take over from there?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, we've got some Americans that may be looking in, and I want to make sure that everybody, clearly understands various issues that's important. Because we're talking about and trying to focus first on the domestic situation within Turkey. So during each of yours testimony, some talked about PKK, some talked about, and I know I mentioned HDP, some talked about PYD, some talked about the Gulen movement, and some talked about the Kurdish movement. So, and when we just, I think, is it simplified to say it's a Kurdish problem, or is there a problem within certain sectors within the Kurdish community? Is that domestic or international? For example, from what I'm hearing, PKK is not domestic. PKK are outside of the boundaries who are trying to infiltrate the boundaries of Turkey. HPD is part of the government, but they're Kurds, and what the situation is there. The Gulen movement, what is that? And who's involved there? Then the PYD, who's in Syria, and then you have the Kurds who are in Iraq, in that scenario. So can someone just, explain, when we're talking about the Kurdish problem, what are we talking about, and who are we talking about?
Sure, if I may. I would separate out the Gulen movement. Let's set that aside for now as a different set of questions that maybe we could come back to later. The HDP is a political party primarily representing Kurds. Most of its constituents, most of its votes come from Kurds, either in the southeast or in Istanbul, which actually has the largest Kurdish population in the country, people who have moved to that city. The PKK is a Turkish Kurdish organization. Now, its militant bases are primarily in northern Iraq or in northern Syria in areas controlled by the PYD, which is very closely affiliated with the PKK. And so you ask, is it a Kurdish problem? It is. It is such a trope in Turkish politics that everyone says, the Kurdish problem. This is what everyone says for just talking about it. They say, the Kurdish problem.
I want to make sure everybody's in agreement with what he just said, the other two witnesses.
Mr. Ranking Member, I don't agree about the PKK. It's a terrorist organization. I just want to make sure.
Okay, but do you agree, he said that the PKK is affiliated with the PYD. They are fighting together in the northern part of Turkey and Syria and Iraq. Is that correct? So we could make sure who's aligned with which. So the PKK is affiliated with the PYD, but does not necessarily have anything to do with the HDP. Is that correct?
Yes, the PKK is a Turkey-based militant organization that's been waging a war, but
So-
the PYD is in Syria.
So again, I'm just trying to focus right now on the focus of this hearing. That's the domestic issues within Turkey, okay? So if what I'm hearing is correct, then Turkey, because, well, no, let me ask another question before I say that. So is the PKK and the PYD focused on changing the government in Turkey? And if they are focused on changing the government in Turkey, are they focused in doing that in a political process or by a military operation?
May I? The PKK is not focused on, the PKK has a political wing, which is the HDP, and they are in the parliament right now. So they're not interested in toppling the government. The Kurds in Turkey...
So hold on, I don't understand. So now you're telling me that the PKK, I mean the HDP is part of the PKK, but they're the political wing of the PKK?
They represent, their base consists of people who are sympathetic to the PKK, but it's larger than that.
Okay.
If I may, it's similar to the Irish Republican Party and Sinn Féin, just as an analogy.
Thank you.
Yes, HDP is a kind of part of PKK, but Turkey is very clear that HDP can deal in the Turkish parliament, not engage with the PKK. I mean, when we look at right now, in 4 cities, they declare autonomous administrations in 4 Turkish cities and set up trenches, planted mines or other explosive near barricades, and converted houses into ammunition depots near the barricades. So every week, 20 Turkish personnel are killed by PKK, and Turkish army right now is taking action against them, not the Kurds.
But what I'm trying to figure out then, if HDP is part of the government, do they have the right to voice their concerns within the government and the freedom to do that as a minority party, since they were elected to be part of an existing government and they are not trying to do something militarily against the government as some others, from what I'm hearing, want to do?
They do. I mean, they have the right to talk and speak at the Turkish parliament. But the biggest problem, Mr. Ranking Member, the HDP leaders are engaging and motivating some Kurdish groups in southern part of Turkey to supporting the declaration of autonomous. I mean, can you imagine a city in the United States, some groups declare autonomous and try to have an independent region in United States? I mean, of course...
Texas tries it sometimes.
Yeah. So this is not acceptable. I mean, there are ways that you need to talk in the Turkish parliament, talk about the investment, how the Turkish government should bring the investment, economical investment to the region.
And I'm out of time, but let me just say this, in my opinion, because I'm just in the United States, if someone wanted to talk about being autonomous, they could talk about it. They could try to gather support for it without it being that someone goes to jail or is prosecuted for it. If they don't gain the support, they can't gain the support. I can't imagine them gaining the support to break up the United States in that regards. I mean, that happened once in the United States history, and that was called the Civil War. But if you ask me today, you know, I know, for example, in New York City, one of the boroughs, Staten Island, had a movement to separate from the city of New York. And the democratic process went on, and we didn't go, you know, against those folks that wanted to separate the borough. So all I'm trying to understand is the democratic process within the country. Now, I understand that if somebody's a terrorist organization outside and militarily trying to overthrow you, the government has the responsibility to protect the government. But if you're within the government and within the people and you're not doing it in a violent way, then you should have the opportunity to voice those concerns. I mean, that's from my thought of view, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. We're going to have a little quiz on the meaning of each and every one of those abbreviations, and I hope you get them right. I remember, can we all remember the LAPD, you know, Los Angeles Police Department, you know? All right. Again, to get more serious, the fact is that we've been talking about an area that now, in the last 4 years, has been, and especially in the last 8 years, but especially the last 4, have drifted into chaos and violence, and hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, are losing their lives. Some of us are very concerned that Assad's hatred, that the hatred by Erdogan of Assad, by some reason, the regimes hating each other, has in some way convinced Erdogan, and we're going to go into this in greater detail, that he should be supporting Islamic opponents of the Assad regime who may be radicals. And it looks like that to some of us. Colonel Cook, could you take over from there?
Thank you very much. Right now, I have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, after listening to all the acronyms. And, question I have for Mr. Schenken, and that is the relationship of Erdogan with the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. Can you give me your opinion on that? I think there's been a radical shift, which is affecting a lot of the region, if you can answer them.
I'll do my best. It's not my area of specialization, but I will say that the now President Erdogan and his government have pursued a strategy in Syria. Their goal in Syria from the beginning was to empower the equivalent of Muslim Brotherhood actors inside Syria.
Yeah, but hasn't there been the whole country, in fact, is, and you mentioned it, or somebody mentioned about how secular it was, perhaps one of the most secular nations in the area, and the shift is going on.
Inside
About
Turkey.
Hamas, can you comment about Hamas?
Well, the relations, Hamas has had individuals who've resided in Turkey at times, and those have been tolerated by.
Does this contribute to the stress that Israel had with that particular country?
I'm sure
Turkey?
it does.
Okay. Moving on a little bit on Erdogan and any activity about the Christians, persecution?
Well, Turkey has official recognized Christian communities. In the Greeks and the Armenians, there are still churches.
But would you say that situation has deteriorated?
I would not say it has deteriorated in the last year. I would say it has always been a very tense and very unpleasant relationship, to say the least. Certainly the ethnic cleansing and the genocide against the Armenians that took place in Turkey is a scar on Turkey's history.
Okay. One other thing, or a couple of things. Mr. Chairman, I'd recommend next time, if we review this, that we actually have a joint Foreign Affairs House Armed Services Committee, because the hidden elephant right here, right now, is one of our most important NATO allies. At least when I was in Turkey, I was really, really disturbed at the restrictions that were placed upon our military personnel, particularly at Incirlik and other places. And this is huge, and I think we've got to ask these questions, because it's going to affect us. And it could just destroy that whole NATO relationship. Moving on a little bit, and that is in regards to the border, that where so many people have fled through Turkey, and what Turkey is doing right now to close that off. And I'm talking about that border, particularly with Syria. Anybody, can they address that shortly? Because I'm running out of time. And I got about 10 more questions.
Well,
Go ahead.
Doctor?
Well, Turkey recently stepped up its border patrol. There is 330 kilometer of trenches on the border.
Is it working?
There is a war. It's not working because there has been Turkey has been doing more, but on the other hand, there are illegal crossings, and we have seen that in the recent Ankara bombing. The attacker he crossed into Turkey very easily, so there have been illegal crossings.
Doctor, let me ask you another question. Is Turkey involved with Libya, politics of Libya right now?
Yes.
Could you go into that a little bit?
Yes, it has been working. It has been working with local Salafi organizations, and Turkey has
Muslim
always.
Brotherhood.
Yes,
Would you characterize it as extreme groups?
they are extreme groups.
I yield back. No further.
So if I could summarize, we have Turkey, there's questions about a level of repression, or one gentleman, one of our witnesses, believes the situation's actually gotten better, because he points to different negotiations that have taken place. Our other witness suggests after the negotiations, the president reneged on the agreement that was made to make things better. So we have an increase of tensions, of killing, of violence. We have now the concept of that same government, same person who's in power, who is involved with providing weapons to people who are radical Islamists, whether it's in Libya or whether it's in Syria in the name of stopping Assad. So we'll go to Mr. Suri.
Thank you for that resume. Thank you for that, Professor. Well, now I got a little bit strained out with these letters but I'm still a little bit confused. You know, with Turkey, I always look at Turkey as taking one step forward and two backwards. I mean, they seem to have come a long way, and then this crackdown on journalists, putting people in jail for insulting the president, for being against the president. I mean, to me, that's just taking two steps backwards. And I think it's the oldest playbook in the world where you have an election coming up, you go after these people in order to control the outcome. So to me, you know, I don't know, Turkey just is an enigma to me. It's a country that has so much potential, and yeah, they do these things. And quite frankly, I don't even know if Turkey should join the EU because the EU is a mess. And you know, they could wait a little longer, see what happens with the EU. But you know, with all this going in Syria and the amount of refugees and everything else, it seems like Cyprus has been forgotten, or an effort to bring a solution to Cyprus. Since 1974, the Turkish have been in Cyprus. They have about 40,000 troops. And the Cyprus people seem to have crossing the green line millions of times. And just when they're getting a little bit close to come to some sort of understanding, they just walk away. I've been to the Green Line. I've been there. And one of the things that I think after 1974 and an effort to bring some sort of solution, I think the Turks should take down that flag that they have on the hill, which is kind of insulting, where you have a whole side of a hill with a Turkish flag and then they light it up at night. I mean, I don't think that's necessary to have that if you want to come to some sort of an understanding and get the Cyprus issue resolved. So I'm just wondering if the economic situation in Turkey gets worse, where do we go from here? Do we continue to go after these people as an excuse? Or do we try to resolve the issues in Turkey? Can you?
Of course. May I just say a few words on the Cyprus negotiations? I think there are negotiations going on between the two parties, Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots, and they're both hopeful that something is going to happen this year. But they haven't yet discussed the most contentious issue of Turkish withdrawal of troops. So that is going to be a main problem because it has to be a solution that Erdogan can agree to. And on your question about economy,
how can you give a solution when you want to leave the troops there?
Yes, that's
the problem.
Yes, they haven't discussed that yet, and that's going to be a problem. And on the question of economy, I think that could be a good thing for Turkish democracy. An economic crisis could be a good thing for Turkish democracy because, contrary to what many people in DC believe, the people in Turkey, those who are voting for the AKP, they're not voting for the AKP because they have Islamist roots. Or Islamist values. They vote for bread and butter issues. So, and we have seen that in June. Many people thought that Erdogan, it was not possible to beat Erdogan, but in June, in fact, the party lost its parliamentary majority, so it can happen. So if there is a problem in Turkish economy, I think we will see the weakening of the AKP, and which I believe will translate into a better, more democratic country.
Mr. Sanar?
Congressman, regarding the Cyprus, as you know, during the Kofi Annan, Secretary General Kofi Annan term, there was a referendum, and then the Greek Cypriots declined to reunification with the north part. So I mean, if the Turkish army has to leave the island before they agreed each other, and it seems like State Department and the administration, I think, is working right now with all parties to get some negotiations, and the president of the Northern Cyprus are also optimistic to might have a reunification on the island. Regarding the economy, when you look at the, as you said, European Union, they are still in a trouble. Turkey is much doing better comparing with the other countries. So it seems like Turkish economy is still stable. I don't think so. There will be a recession in 2016, and they are taking also more investment plans for this year.
Well, I'll just speak on the question of the economy and of whether Turkish voters get a chance to have a say again. The issue is that Turkey has been through a run of elections now, 4 elections in 2 years, and they don't have more unless the government decides to call early elections. So essentially the political agenda at this point is whether the AKP, the President Erdogan's party, can reach the supermajority necessary to call a constitutional referendum on a presidential system. And if such a referendum is called, that would be the next moment when we find out whether President Erdogan still has a mandate. But barring that, or barring early elections, we don't have another vote when there is a time that this train stops.
And just one last question. It seems that Turkey seems to depend on Russia for about 20–25% of its energy. I would just warn Turkey that the Russians cut off the gas to the Ukraine in the middle of winter. So I'd be a little bit concerned knocking down their planes. Thank you.
Mr. Moreno.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. You know, Turkey is clearly the linchpin of American interests and policies in many areas. Turkey is an ally of the U.S., and we appreciate that relationship. I've been to Turkey, I've been to Istanbul. The people and the government were extremely generous to our CODEL that visited there. I do have a concern about the restrictions concerning U.S. military personnel in Turkey, and I hope that the President takes that into a very serious consideration when addressing the relationship with the U.S. But I want to switch gears here a little bit. I want to talk about Turkey's relationship with Russia via Turkey's relationship with the United States. Just recently, Defense Secretary Carter said that Russia is one of the top threats to global order. In fact, he put ISIS down, I think, either 3rd or 4th on that. I would like you to give me some insight, each of you, and I'd like to start with Dr. Toll, ladies before gentlemen. What you see are Turkey's relationship with the United States, and then Turkey's relationship with Russia concerning the interests of the United States. Do you understand my question?
Sure.
Please.
Turkey, as Mr. Congressman just mentioned, Turkey is dependent on Russian energy, and that's made things very difficult for Turkey, and that was one of the reasons why Turkey could be able to compartmentalize its relations with Russia despite differing stances in Syria. Until very recently, until Turkey shut down a Russian jet.
That was in Turkey's airspace.
Yes, but it had happened many times. It just happened recently again. I think right now the main concern for Turkey in Turkey-Russia relations is what Russia is doing in Syria. So the Russian military buildup poses a great challenge for Turkey's strategy in Syria. Now Turkey has been asking for a no-fly zone in northern Syria, and now there's a no-fly zone, a de facto no-fly zone, enforced by Russia. Turkish planes cannot fly in northern Syria because of the Russian S-400 missiles. And the Russians are also, they're attacking the Turkey-backed Syrian opposition groups. They are attacking the Turkmens. The Turkmens, they are ethnically related to Turkey, and they've been Turkey's B-plan almost in Syria. They've been training them militarily, they've been working with them closely, and Russians, they've been bombing them. So Russian military buildup in Syria has been a great challenge for Turkey. And also in Iraq, Russia is trying to play an important role in the region that really make things very difficult for Turkey's Middle East policy.
Thank you. Mr. Çınar?
So, Congressman, regarding the U.S.-Turkish from the military aspect, I would like to share a small quote from the General John Allen, what he said on the testimony on Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He said, "We must not forget the Turkish government, a critical partner in this fight, which recently increased its participation in the coalition, opening its bases to US and other coalition members, and conducting airstrikes on ISIL targets inside Syria alongside other coalition aircraft. This cooperation has already had an impact and will continue to have significant impact on our operations in Syria." So when we look at Russia right now, and the Pentagon also, when I look at the statements, Pentagon also said Russia airstrikes are not targeting the ISIL 100%. 80% of the airstrikes, Russian airstrikes, targeting the Assad regime's opponents. So, and we know the United States and the other coalitions' strategy on fighting against ISIS, and Turkey is on that coalition. So there is actually big, right now, argument between the both sides. And I believe Turkey and United States will have a much stronger military strategic partnership in this year.
Mr. Shankin.
Thank you. I'll follow on what Mr. Chinar said.
30 seconds.
I think there's a temptation to see Russia as an ally in Syria because of the Russian messaging about what its goals are in Syria. But I think the fact is Russia, under its current government, defines its interests in terms of opposition to the West. This is how the current government of Russia defines its interests, whether it's in Syria or whether it is in Ukraine or in Europe. And given that, it is impossible to see how those interests are going to converge. Russia will move its goals if it sees them converging with the United States, because its goal is to increase its leverage against the United States in any possible outcome in Syria.
I see my time has expired. Thank you very much. Yield back.
We will have another hearing on Russia to go through those issues, whether or not Russia is basing its policies on what criteria. Some people think that we have pushed Russia in that direction with an endless hostility. Others believe that Russia is just playing on its heritage of for the last 100 years of being an adversary of the United States.
I look forward to that
So
discussion.
we'll have an honest discussion on that. Both sides will always be presented in my hearings. Ms. Gabbard?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shank, I'll start with you. If you can talk about Turkey's standing within NATO. I think both you and Dr. Toll have talked about different examples of where Turkey has worked in a direct opposite manner to the objectives that the United States and our NATO allies are working towards in the effort to defeat ISIS. Why is it that stronger accountability measures have not been taken against Turkey from different NATO allies with respect to the open border with Syria and the continued open flow of foreign fighters who are going and working with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and other Islamic extremist groups in Syria who are working to overthrow Assad so that they can take over all of Syria and establish their caliphate? The direct and indirect support that Turkey provides to some of these Islamic extremist groups who are fighting towards that end in Syria, and Turkey's focus on defeating the Kurds rather than standing with NATO allies and the United States against ISIS.
Thank you. I think the Turkish relationship with NATO has certainly been extremely complicated by the war in Syria. Turkey has seen its interests in Syria as diverging at times from what NATO interests are. I would argue, however, that Turkey has, and this is despite the fact that I've been very critical of Turkish government, as you can see in my testimony domestically, the Turkish government has in fact changed its policies regarding the border. It has taken steps to attempt
Why
to
haven't they closed it? After all this time and as strong of a military as Turkey has, why have they not closed the border and stopped these foreign fighters from coming in and out and going back into Europe?
They would be the ones to answer specifically, but my opinion would be many of those fighters that are fighting in Aleppo, for instance, and who lost their corridor today, are also being supported by the United States.
Which is a problem.
But that is a question then not of diverging from NATO strategy or United States strategy. That is a question of NATO or United States strategy. So I don't think it's simply that Turkey has gone off on its own tangent completely in opposition to what NATO or the United States have been trying to do. What NATO and the United States have been trying to do in Syria has been a moving target, and it has changed. It clearly continues to evolve, and it can be at times hard to say what the goals are.
Mr. Chinar, can you comment on that?
Sure. Congressman, first of all, Turkey is not defeating Kurds. They are defeating the PKK terrorists. So I just want to...
But to Dr. Toll's point, they are working to defeat some of the very same Kurdish groups who are fighting against ISIS on the ground in northern Syria.
Correct. So it's linked with the PYD. That's why for Turkey, it's a terrorist organization, same as ISIS. Regarding the border security, yes, you are right. I mean, Turkey needs to improve to securing the border, and it seems like there's a much stronger cooperation with the U.S. and the other allies. And also, let's keep in mind that most of the foreigners are coming, fighters are coming from the west side, especially from the European side. And if they have the British passports, French passports, and if Turkey doesn't get the intelligence sharing from the Europe, then Turkey is not going to stop them at the borders, and they are going to just use the Turkish as a bridge. So it's very important that Europe also share the strong intelligence with the Turkey.
Are you saying that Turkey, if there's someone with a British or French passport coming in through Turkey and attempting to enter Syria, that there is some form of, that they're marking that down, that they know which British and French and foreign fighters are coming through Turkey into Syria, and then therefore able to provide that intelligence back into the EU and other countries?
No, if they get notified by Europe.
But if they don't know, if these people haven't been identified in the EU prior to their going through Turkey to fight in Syria with groups like ISIS.
Right, if they have a British passport and if Turkey doesn't know that they are ISIS volunteers or fans, and if they don't get notification from the origin country, how can Turkey stop them at the border? So I think it's an intelligence sharing issue that both parties need to solve that.
So you're saying that they are enforcing the border, just not stopping these foreign fighters from going through. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. The intelligence sharing.
So the border is enforced by Turkey.
The security, it's a 511 kilometers. It's a long border.
So the 97 kilometers that President Obama talked about and others have admitted that Turkey is not enforcing on the border, that is completely closed and enforced at this point?
It's not completely closed, but what I see is from the State Department statements, ISIS start to encourage some of them to go to Libya or North Africa countries to join the ISIS.
So that just goes to my point, that Turkey has no excuse for allowing these openings in their border which further helps these Islamic extremist groups.
Right, no excuse, but with the support of the European allies.
Well, both the U.S. and European countries, they've been pushing Turkey to close the border. In May of 2015, Turkey closed the last 2 border crossings. I think it's a matter of capability and political will. Compared to last year, the political will is I think there, but there are still illegal crossings, and the security forces on the border, they're turning a blind eye to those illegal crossings. And I think Turkey could do, it has been doing more, and I think it could do more, but I think the Turkish security forces are overstretched because they've been waging a war against the PKK. And secondly, your question about why Turkey is attacking the Kurds in Syria, it all goes back to Turkey's the domestic drivers. I mean, one of the reasons why the ceasefire broke down was this Turkey's fear of the PYD's empowerment. The Kurds, they've been one of the main beneficiaries of the Arab uprisings. They are very strong. The PYD has become a close ally of the United States in Syria. Europeans, they've been supporting that. So Turkey, this heightened Turkey's fear of an independent Kurdistan, another entity, autonomous entity on its doorstep. And that's why I think that drove, that's one of the reasons why Turkey has been very unwilling to go back to the negotiating table with the Kurds, and that's why Turkey attacked the PYD.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If at some point in the future you were to hold a hearing on the Kurds specifically, I think it would give us a good opportunity to really dive into the situation so that we can hear from all sides and understand, while we hear what Turkey says and why they're attacking the Kurds. From the Kurdish perspective, we saw in the recent elections how the HDP, as soon as they won enough seats in parliament to threaten Erdogan's power, were manipulated. The elections were manipulated, and things turned out so that Erdogan was able to maintain his situation. So I hope that in the future we'll have the opportunity to dig into that further.
We always appreciate everyone on this committee, your direction and guidance and suggestions. In this case, I will check to see if we have jurisdiction to hold such a hearing. Kurds may or may not, but the fact that the Kurds are part of Turkey, at least there's a connection there. And because this is not the Middle East, of course, subcommittee, but I will check to see if we can get permission to do that, and appreciate that suggestion from you. We now have Mr. Conley, who will make his disagreement with the chair absolutely clear.
I thank my friend. I sometimes wonder on our committee when we talk about Turkey whether we can step back a little bit and look at context and attributes as opposed to looking for fault only, none of which is to diminish the legitimate concerns all of us have about various trends in Turkey and about the role of President Erdogan in his philosophy about accreting power and how to use it. Turkey is and has been a reliable NATO ally since the founding of NATO. Turkey has been an interlocutor between Israel and its neighbors in the Middle East and has played a pivotal and positive role in that regard since the founding of the State of Israel. It has accepted 2 million refugees from Syria without much help from the international community. 2 million. It shares an enormous border with Syria and an enormous border with Iran. It's a dangerous neighborhood. It is key to a Cyprus settlement. There won't be a Cyprus settlement if we're not involving Turkey in a meaningful way. We share a military base on Turkish soil. Mr. Schenken mentioned 4 elections in the last 2 years. I believe, Mr. Schenken, I'm right, that our own State Department has said, by and large, they've been free and fair.
I will not speak to, the OSCE has said they were free but questioned the fairness.
Well,
if I may.
I sometimes question our elections, how fair they are, but I mean, not perfect, but where else in the region can you point to? And I will point out Erdogan suffered, in a sense, arguably, 2 losses. First one outright, the second one he didn't, he didn't get the supermajority he wanted and needed because the voters in Turkey had a different point of view. None of this is to whitewash real issues. But there is a context here. We want to make Turkey a more stable, democratic state. It's in our interest to have European integration with Turkey, not to push it away. History has a lot of bumps and a lot of tragedies, and it should be recognized. But it shouldn't be dispositive. We are where we are, and this relationship is a critical one. Let's not kick it away. Having said that, Mr. Schenken, you outlined concerns, and I share your concerns. There are anti-democratic impulses that have manifested themselves in Erdogan's own approach with respect to the press, with respect to dissent, I guess I'd invite you to comment on that a little bit, and you and the other 2 witnesses as well. How worried should we be about that, and are there countervailing forces that can be looked to try to redress what is in fact happening in Turkey? From this distance, it's alarming.
Thank you. It's very alarming, and I think we should be very worried. I think the return to violence and a return to an open conflict inside the country comes on top of what was already a very grave situation. You asked, are there things within the society that might hold it back? Yes, there are. Turkey is a diverse country. It's a pluralist country. You are correct to note that the electoral system functions better than many other electoral systems in the neighborhood. There are major concerns about the media environment and how that affects the ability of voters to access information or to make judgments fairly. But there is diversity. There is still outspokenness in Turkish society, even though it's punished quite frequently. So I do think there is some hope, but it is grim, and it's getting grimmer.
Mr. Sinner?
Yes. Congressman, yes, there are some issues in Turkey, and as I said, there are some improvements that what I see. And I'll give you an example about the freedom recently, and it was on the discussion many times about the academic freedom. Freedom of expression is safeguarded in the Turkish constitution and other relevant legislation. Yet it goes without saying that academic freedom shouldn't be abused for political ends. And Article 130 of the Turkish constitution clearly states, and I quote, "Universities and members of teaching staff and their assistants may freely engage in all kinds of scientific research and publication. However, this shall not be include the liberty to engage in activities against the existence and independence of the state and against the integrity and invisibility of the nation and the country." So since I do have the media credentials and I sometimes write articles, and I respect my colleagues and the journalists, but some of them, if they are sharing the national intelligence information to the public, then the Turkish government says that it's illegal. They can't do that. So there are lots of discussion going on. I mean, there should be an improvement on that sense. But there are also regulations that there is no threat for the Turkish unity in the country.
Mr. Chairman, if I might be allowed just two more points. One is just a comment on Mr. Schenken. You talked about Russia and Syria, and you characterized their behavior as just anti-West. They don't like us. And I guess I would respectfully suggest to you it's maybe a little more than that. I mean, Syria, since Hafez al-Assad was the Soviet Union's one client state in the region. And that goes back to 1970. So almost 50 years of investment. They've got military presence in Syria. It's all they got. And Putin, in a long tradition, now a Russian tradition, previously a Soviet tradition, doesn't want to give it up. And is going to fight and can be expected to fight. I'm not justifying his behavior at all. But I mean, I think it's more that than it is culturally anti-West. I think it is protecting Russian interests, perceived interests, that is fueling a lot of his behavior with respect to Syria. I mean, I wouldn't deny either there's a patina of anti-Western bias and chip on the shoulder that Putin has, no question about it. But I do think they are looking at this not so much from a cultural, even political point of view. It's a geostrategic point of view where if they lose that, they lose all toehold in the region. And they don't want to do that. And you may want to comment, but let me, before you do, just one more thing, and then I'll cease and desist, Mr. Chairman. I would like you, all of you, to have an opportunity, if you wish, from the United States point of view, and I worry how much this causes friction in our relationship with Turkey. Increasingly here, certainly in the Congress, I think, we see the Peshmerga as a very positive force with which we can work. They're pro-American. They are willing to fight. They've gained territory. Why wouldn't we partner with them, equip them, train them, and help them along the way in recapturing lost ground to ISIL? And I sense that that puts us on a collision course, frankly, with the government of Turkey, because they don't distinguish between, let us say, PKK and the Peshmerga, and we most certainly do. And with that, I'll be quiet, and if the chairman will indulge, to allow the panel to respond.
Well, thank you very much. I will have to say that This is somewhat of a miracle. Hearing my distinguished colleague from Virginia giving the benefit of the doubt to scurrilous charges against the Putin regime, giving benefit of the doubt to the Putin regime on this. They're just being mean and nasty because they're mean and nasty, not because of their habitually being mean and nasty.
Yeah, let's not go crazy, Mr. Chairman.
All right, and let me note that this hearing has been very good in that we have now some challenges ahead of us. One is to have a hearing specifically on the Kurds and all of these issues dealing with the Kurds. We will also have a hearing, and again, every one of my hearings, we try to have both sides represented. I insist on that, and to give everybody a chance to make their case. So we will have one on Russia as well.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think any of us on our side of the aisle would ever question how fair you've been. No question about it. I just wonder if he would indulge the panel to respond to that last point.
Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Regarding Russia, just briefly, I didn't mean to imply that this is a culture war or that there is some kind of essential Russian-ness that leads it into conflict with the West. I think your characterization is correct. However, I would argue that the Russian definition, this current Russian government's definition of its interests is whether it gains vis-a-vis the West. And so it simply can't align them right now with the United States because it constantly redefines them in terms of its position and its status vis-a-vis the United States. And that makes it, I know that the Secretary of State and others are always seeking non-zero-sum outcomes, but you can't have a non-zero-sum outcome if the other partner is changing the equation. And I'll leave the other question for others.
Well, actually,
regarding the Peshmerga and the PYD. My understanding is that the United States is working closely with the PYD in northern Syria. They're working closely with them, not only as spotters for aerial operations, but also probably providing weapons and perhaps even providing training or other kinds of support. That seems to be certainly the most effective in that region of Syria in the fight against ISIS. One of the core questions, however, is that not all of these parts of Syria where the Islamic State is successful and operational, are Kurdish areas. They're not inhabited majority by Kurds. And so a Kurdish group, a Kurdish militia, will not have the legitimacy to hold those areas, even if they are cleared of the Islamic State. And that makes it very difficult to say that we can simply outsource this work onto the PYD and say that's how we solve the Islamic State problem. There have to be Sunni Arab allies for the United States in Syria. And as Congresswoman Gabbard was suggesting, yes, some of these are Islamist groups, if not all of them at this point. That is the tough choice that the United States is dealing with in its policy inside Syria.
Why don't we give the other two panelists a chance to get a 1-minute summary of what you'd like to finish up the hearing with? Go right ahead.
Sure. Congressman, regarding the Peshmergas, Turkey, I just want to give the facts. Turkey loaned $500 million to Kurdish regional government to help meet the budgetary need of the government. So in addition to the financial support, Turkey continues to provide the military support to the Kurdish Peshmerga forces. So it's not the PYD issue, but Turkey is supporting the other Kurdish groups that are fighting against ISIS. So far, Turkey also has trained and equipped over 2,300 Peshmerga forces and facilitated transfer to Peshmerga from northern Iraq to Syria through Turkey. As you said, Turkey shouldn't be kick it away. Turkey shouldn't be punished. Unfortunately, Turkey is not doing a great PR, what they are doing right now. So Turkey and United States should closely working, military strategic partnership should be improved this year and beyond. And I believe that with this kind of hearings and collaborations at the both administration will improve the relationship. Thank you.
Mr. Congressman, you mentioned that you would like Turkey to be a stable and a democratic country. I believe Turkey will not be a stable country until it's democratic. Yes, you're right. The elections were free, but it's an electoral democracy, and there's more to democracy. Freedom of expression is one of the most fundamental pillars of democracy, and it's lacking. And even in this room, I can count at least 2 people who have been victimized by lack of freedom of expression and media freedom, and were fired because of their critical views of the government. And it's not just a matter of lack of freedom of expression or media freedom, but basic rights and freedoms are missing, and that's why there is a Kurdish political movement that is fighting. And that's why we have 200 civilians who got killed in a matter of few months. Those people, they're not asking to topple the regime. They're not looking for a new regime. All they're asking for is they want to be able to have the right to have an education in Kurdish. They want a new definition of citizenship, a civic definition of citizenship that's not ethnocentric. And they want to revise the vague definition of anti-terrorism law because they've been victimized by that law.
We agree, Dr. Toll.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And we're going to have 2 summaries, one by Mr. Meeks and then myself, and then we'll close the hearing. Thank you.
And I will be very brief. I want to thank the witnesses, and I think in just listening and in trying to educate ourselves, you have helped us tremendously. And if I was to summarize where we are and the conversation that we have, I think I could do it in 1 word, well, 2 words. It's complicated. For sure, I believe that Turkey has to look out for its own national interests, and that if there was a extremist group that was attacking it, et cetera, just as we would in the United States, that Turkey has to do what Turkey has to do to make sure it preserves its government in moving forward. But I also believe that the people, just as Dr. Toll has talked about, should have the right to dissent and to give their viewpoints and to run in government, and if they get elected, to participate without fear of being persecuted or prosecuted. That is what a democratic society is all about. And from what I've heard, and I just think 3 excellent witnesses, Mr. Chairman, and the perspectives that you come from, is that we've got to try to figure it out. But most importantly, the Turkish people have to try to, when I call the Turkish people, if you're living in Turkey, whether you're Kurd or not, I'm talking about the Turkish people, everyone that's there who are citizens of Turkey, have to figure out how you get to a table, you work it out, and you resolve these differences, because it's important not only for Turkey, but in a glowing and interconnected world, it's important for the entire region, and thereby really important for every one of us. So again, thank you for really good insights and helping this committee understand what's going on domestically in Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meeks. We will both do a little course before we have the next hearing on what all those abbreviations mean, those different designations. It does get complicated. It gets real complicated. Let me just note, again, thank you to the witnesses. We have had some interesting discussion. We have also basically brought forward the need for 2 other hearings that that this chairman and the ranking member will work on, in terms of one just specifically about the Kurds, specifically dealing with the Kurds wherever they are in that region, then one specifically about Russia, and we will have, again, witnesses on both sides of the issues dealing with those particular entities. Let me just say that in terms of this issue today, the reason for this hearing, it's evident to some of us, and I'm glad we had another witness to explain that there's some other perspectives on this, but that Turkey is going in the wrong direction. And I'm very happy, as I say, that Mr. Sinar actually, was able to present some of the positive sides that we should certainly look into and make that part of our decision-making process. But those of us who are concerned, we see a president trying to change the law to extend his rule. I will have to say that I just visited Mount Vernon with my children. God blessed me and my family with triplets 11 years ago, so I brought them up to Mount Vernon. And one of the great things that we had in this country was the fact that our first president set down the custom, and then it became law after FDR violated the custom, which is that a president's last 2 terms of 8 years, and that's enough to be president. And after that, it begins to corrupt. And I think that we are beginning to see that signs of either corruption or corruption of power, and not just money, but of power, desire for power, taking place in Turkey. And we see also the incredible problems that are going on right now and have been going on with Turkey. There's always been this drug trafficking that's gone across Turkey that has corrupted their society. Human trafficking is a huge problem, and a lot of the traffickers come through Turkey and go right into Albania and the Balkans, and that too should be an issue of concern to us. And of course, we see that Turkey, instead of playing the part of we are a more democratic Islamic country, thus we are going to become a force for moderation and reconciliation to try to find peaceful solutions, we more and more find Turkey looking towards the military and saying, actually, we're going to side with one radical group or another, or even decide that they're going to shoot down a Russian airplane that was over their territory for 30 seconds after it had already left. And let me just note, American planes and all sorts of planes cross people's borders all the time. Of course, this was in a combat mission. That plane was in a combat mission, we know that. But it was in a combat mission in order, and here's another thing that we will be looking into, whether or not, when we're talking about Assad and this whole relationship to Turkey and Syria, the leaders of these 2 countries, which obviously are looking at each other as enemies, whether or not simply becoming an enemy of Assad means that that those forces that are being bombed are in some way democratic as compared to radical Islamic, as well as Erdogan's assessment that the Kurds are by definition, because they're against him, they're in some way radical. This is an economy that is, there are connections here in logic that need to be examined to see if that in any way is attached to reality, or if this isn't just people excusing their own military action against whatever group is against them. I would suggest, and we will go into again whether or not Assad is, those people against Assad are, I'm sure some of them are very democratic, but frankly, we heard the same in Libya, and we've heard the same in other countries, that it's better sometimes not to help overthrow a dictator unless we know that there will be a democratic government that will replace it, instead of a radical Islamic government that wants to be allied with people who want to hurt us. And that's why when that plane was shot down over Turkey, I assumed that plane would have ended up killing terrorists who want to kill us. And if that was the case, that was not something a friend of the United States should be doing, as keeping alive those kind of people. Finally, let us note this. There are, as I said, I think, and it's clear that there are people in Turkey, the opposition, loyal Turks, people who love their country, who are very concerned that the country is not becoming more democratic, or it's actually becoming less democratic, and that there are more controls on journalists than there were before. Clearly, there are more control on journalists now than there were before. And also on opposition, for example, the Gluenists, I guess that's how you pronounce it, and we've looked into those people, and they were a very legitimate opposition. In any other democratic society, they would have been a perfectly acceptable part of the national debate. And Erdogan's regime has declared them the enemy, and they've been arrested, they've been persecuted, basically. And this is a group of people, yes, they have a tie of sort of a liberalization philosophy and a humanitarian philosophy, and they're Islamicists. But having them repressed, I mean, they were basically been declared the enemy of the government there, just because they disagree with what the government wants and is trying to educate people to an alternative. That's somewhat similar to the Falun Gong in China, who are brutally repressed and actually murdered by the Chinese government. These are things that we need to talk about, we need to bring out to public debate, and let us hope that, and I'm going to close it with this, let us hope that Turkey does go in the right direction. For those of us who, over the years, and I have visited Turkey many, many times during the Cold War, I visited Turkey many times and was so proud that they were standing with us at a time when it was the Soviet Union and not Russia. The Soviet Union had targeted Turkey. They were putting millions of dollars and undermining that government and their freedom and their independence as much as they possibly could do, and the Turkish people stood tall. And we shouldn't ever forget that unanimity we had, that support that we had when it really counted from the people of Turkey. So with that, we close this hearing. It is adjourned.